What are some wholesome historical facts not taught in school? In 2006, while the Ivory Coast was in the midst of a civil war, the opposing sides agreed to a ceasefire so that they could all watch the World Cup. The break in fighting paved the way for a peace agreement a year later. Didier Drogba, legend. During the Revolutionary War, a British general left his dog behind during a chaotic retreat. When the Continental Army found the lost dog, George Washington had a messenger go under a truce flag to return the dog to its owner. Truly a human's best friend. The F1 German Grand Prix in 1976. After Niki Lauda crashed while hitting a barrier and catching a light, rival drivers Arturo Merzario, Guy Edwards, Harold Ertel and Brett Lunger all stopped their cars and ran to Lauda's aid. There are many such instances of this happening during the 50s right through the 80s, of championship drivers forfeiting a win to save a rival's life. And then he won his second championship the very next year. He also retired from driving, then came back, and won another championship 2 years later by half a point. After a crash like he had. Most drivers wouldn't be the same after that. Not Niki though, it just made him stronger. R.I.P. Niki. During World War II, a German fighter pilot spotted a damaged American bomber, and rather than shooting it down, he decided to escort it to safety. Decades later, the two pilots found each other and became friends. AWW. I think I saw a documentary on that before, or some video of the reunion. Not sure if it's the same thing though. When the pharaoh Mentuhotep II's harem daughter died around 2050 BC, he mourned. She was only 5 years old. Her tomb, touchingly, was inscribed with the pet name Might. This is translated to kitten. OP said wholesome. Now I'm about to shed a tear. The candy bomber. After World War II ended and Berlin was divided, the UK and US dropped food into West Berlin by plane. One pilot, Gail Halverson, started to donate his candy rations to the children, and soon other pilots started doing the same. To let the children know that it was his plane, the one with the candy, they would wiggle the plane's wings before the drop. Word spread and more children would come, and it started a new PR campaign and started to change the mindset that Americans had of giving food aid to Europe. I always thought the story was really sweet. Halverson's still around, too. He turns 100 this the 10th of October. My Balkanic friends have told me that the bitter combats of the wars after the breakup of Yugoslavia used to stop because both sides liked watching Mexican soap operas. Mexican soap operas, the true olive branch. The India-Pakistan border is one of the most disputed ones in the world, giving rise to the world-renowned hostilities between India and Pakistan. There was a time once, a prominent Indian singer, namely Lata Mangeshkar, had gone to perform a concert for the soldiers there. As soon as the show began, Pakistani troops started firing rounds in the air, yelled obscenities and said, "We want to hear her voice too," so Indian forces turned up the speakers and pointed them towards the border. Pakistani forces returned the favor when prominent Pakistani singers came to perform for them. I've heard that Indian and Pakistani soldiers get together to watch the India vs Pakistan cricket matches. The only reason the pilgrims stopped at Plymouth Rock was they were running out of beer. They had to grow barley and hops. Based on Eric the Red's account, the first ritual done in the New World was when a German, Balkan, slave was found praising the berries identical to ones used for brewing in his homeland. Ringo Starr once decided the Beatles didn't need him and decided to take a holiday with the intention of never coming back. When John, Paul and George found out, they went all the way to where he was staying just to convince him to come back. As I recall, he got sick of all the bickering during the recording of the White Album, so it's actually Paul playing the drums on the first few songs. When Ringo came back, his drum kit was all decked out with flowers. Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers who believed that the light of God shined in everyone regardless of ethnicity or religion. They were known for treating the indigenous people relatively well and welcomed the first synagogue in North America in Philadelphia. That is true. They also created the basis for solitary confinement in prisons, so there are some drawbacks. In the Second World War, British Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmeadow was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross because a German admiral who witnessed his gallantry in action wrote to the British and recommended the award. There was a huge fight about African Americans using the public pool in Mr. Rogers' actual neighborhood, so he made an episode on his show where he and an African American guest were sharing a kiddie pool and talking about being nice to people even if they look or sound different. He taught a whole generation that racism isn't fair or right. Mr. Rogers always said he was feeding his fish out loud because he had heard that a little girl who was blind was worried about them. So he audibly said it so she wouldn't have to worry anymore. Not really a historical figure, but one we all know. Mr. Rogers definitely counts as a historical figure and you cannot change my mind. After Commodore Perry forced the opening of Japan to foreign trade, Japan signed many unequal treaties with Western nations. 1888, Mexico signed another treaty with Japan, but Mexico viewed Japan as an equal. The 1888 Mexican-Japanese Treaty was the first time a Western nation treated Japan as an equal. In the late 1930s, fascism was advancing through the world and no one dared to oppose it, except for Mexico. Mexico was the only country that openly protested against the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, Italian and German involvement in the Spanish Civil War, along with the USSR, and finally, the German annexation of Austria. In Vienna we named the square Mexicoplatz, Mexico Square, in honor of Mexico being the only country that protested the Nazi annexation of Austria. Horton Hears, who was written for a Japanese friend of Dr. Seuss immediately following World War II. He wrote it as an allegory about the importance of forgiveness and humanity in a time where much of the world was still bitter at Japan for their role on the war. Horton represents the United States who speaks up for Hoville, the Japanese, to remind them that a person is a person no matter how small. During the Crusades, when Richard the Lionhearted had a fever, all he wanted at the moment was some fruit and a cold drink. His enemy, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt who had seized control over Jerusalem, heard the news and sent him peaches, pears, and a shipment of ice from a mountain. When he heard that King Richard's horse had been killed, he sent him a bunch of new horses and a stable boy. It's taught an island but IDK about the us. When we had the potato famine, millions of Irish were dying emigrating, and the Choctaw tribe heard of this and despite being extremely poor managed to raise I think around $200. And now we've helped them out and raised $1.5 million to help them with COVID-19. About $6.50 in today's money. There's also a monument in Cork called the Kindred Spirit that was built in honor of the tribes. Imagine that kind of togetherness on a worldwide scale. In the late 1800s and early 1900s there were a few Supreme Court cases about the color of margarine. The dairy industry couldn't compete as well with margarine dyed the color of butter, so some states tried to pass laws saying margarine had to be pink, which the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional. However, they also decided that yellow margarine was defrauding the public, so for a while margarine was sold white with a packet of yellow dye that you could mix in at home. TLDR, they could believe it was not butter. I can't tell if this is wholesome or not, lol. On Christmas Day 1914, both of the sides of World War I celebrated Christmas together with songs and games. This type of celebrations happened over the whole front in Belgium and France. The soldiers talked to each other like they weren't in war together. Many soldiers wrote in their diary that they didn't expected the enemy to be so kind and friendly and that they wanted to meet with them when the war was over. But a few days later, the leaders of the armies found out about the celebrations and forbid any future meetings between the two sides. There were a few attempts to reconnect during Easter and Christmas, but the soldiers who attempted were punished or killed. There's an amazing movie about this event called Joyeux Noël if you want to know more about it. An actually true fact about Liechtenstein is that Switzerland accidentally invaded Liechtenstein during a Swiss army exercise when some soldiers got lost and accidentally walked into Liechtenstein on two separate occasions. So Switzerland has accidentally invaded Liechtenstein twice. 3 times if you count the Swiss missile test that landed in Liechtenstein and lit a forest on fire. Wojtek was a bear that served in the Polish 2nd Artillery Unit. During his service, Wojtek was a huge moral boost to the men. fighting multiple men in wrestling matches, eating lit cigarettes, and even foiling a Saudi Arabian plot to attack to camp by discovering a spy in the shower. Wojtek's unit was caught in artillery battle. Wojtek looked around and began carrying artillery shells to the launchers like the men around him. For his service, Wojtek was promoted to corporal and was given a honorable discharge. Wojtek was placed in a local zoo where he was every once in a while known to appear at a child's birthday party. Fellow servicemen from his unit were also known to come by and feed him lit cigarettes, where he also sadly died. In his honor, the Polish artillery unit changed its logo to a bear holding an artillery shell. Wojtek was a bear that served. I'm the Polish 2nd Artillery Unit. Nice to meet you, Polish 2nd Artillery Unit. Abraham Lincoln decided to grow a beard because of 11-year-old Grace Biddle. She had written him that she thought he would look more handsome and less sad with a beard, and women would tell their husbands to vote for him. So he grew a beard and was elected. On his way to his inauguration, he took a train and passed through her hometown in Westfield, New York, and met her. The Chicago Public Library originated with a donation of books from Queen Victoria following the Great Chicago Fire. She assumed the city's library had burned down. Pirate ships were actually pretty great, relatively speaking. They were very democratic and pirate crews were pretty well cared for. Also, they took sexual assault against women very seriously. That is, they killed you for it. Also, pirates were really rare. The vast majority of seafaring raiders were privateers, which were basically mercenary ships who were hired by a country to attack the shipping of an enemy nation. There was a Scotsman named Bill Million who stood on the beaches at Normandy during D-Day calmly playing the bagpipes as shells and machine gun fire streaked past him. The Germans didn't shoot him because they figured he must have been insane. When persecuted Zoroastrians from Persia came to the kingdom of Sanjan in the west coast of India as refugees, the king wasn't sure if he wanted to offer them refuge, so he sent them a full glass of milk implying his kingdom is full. The leader of the Zoroastrians added some sugar to the milk and sent it back to imply the refugees would become part of the kingdom and make it sweeter. They got to stay, and though are a micro-minority, they are one of the most successful community which has left its imprint on every aspect of India. I heard this story before on Reddit, but I think it was adding a lotus that floated or something, I dunno. I was on vacation in Germany over spring break. They have these frog fences. These fences keep the frogs from crossing the roads and getting run over. At the end of the day, somebody comes by and gathers the frogs and helps them cross the road. Not only in Germany, and fences are not only to keep the frogs safe but also the drivers. So many frogs might pass a stretch of a road that it gets slippery from all the crushed frogs and somebody could get hurt. But where I live, they started installing blue reflectors to the road markers which are designed to warn wildlife, mostly deer, and keep them from running onto the roads. Under a Supreme Court ruling in the 1800s, tomatoes are considered a vegetable because you can't make a dessert out of it. The ruling came from California having tariffs on fruits because at the time it was believed only people with a bit of wealth could buy fruit because they were only really used to make a dessert. Tomatoes were part of the tariff, so people protested and the Supreme Court removed tomatoes from the tariff, meaning they aren't a fruit in the eyes of the law. My fuzzy recollections from the book Founding Brothers. Ben Franklin, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were assigned to stay in France part-time to help build that alliance during the period 1776 to 1787, the period of the Revolutionary War and the Continental Congress. This friendship between France and the colonies guided France to help protect the colonies during the war. The relationship and the protections likely saved the colonies from rule under the English king during the period between the Declaration of Independence and the eventual signing of the US Constitution. Candidate hopefuls for president of the US were expected to not run for the office but rather await being proposed for the position by others. The loser of a presidential election became the vice president. Hence, Washington Adams were the first and then Adams Jefferson after 8 years of Washington. Franklin once almost killed himself trying to electrocute a turkey. He thought it might tenderize the bird. Founding Brothers, BTW, is an excellent way to learn about the founding fathers, their personalities and interactions, and yes, dirty politics. Clark Gable nearly quit Gone with the Wind early in production when he found out that the set was segregated. He told the director that either they'd take down the white and colored signs, or they'd have no Red Butler. He also wanted to boycott the Atlanta premiere when he found out that his black co-stars could not attend. He only went after Hattie McDaniel, who went on to be the first black Oscar winner for her role in the film, urged him to go. He remained close friends with her for the rest of his life. Norway sends a Christmas tree to London every year in thanks to the help we gave them in World War II. It's put up in Trafalgar Square. Until the invention of submarine warfare, it was widely considered an abominable war crime to sink a ship and not try to save its crew. Sinking civilian shipping was completely off limits if preparations were not made to rescue the entire civilian crew and transport them to safety at a port somewhere. It is still technically considered part of customary international law, but it wasn't enforced in World War I or World War II because both sides committed this war crime. Tu quoque, Latin meaning you too, was a valid legal defense in war crimes trials. No Germans could be convicted of a war crime if they could show that the Allies had committed the same crime. An attempt was made to charge a German admiral for having a submarine attack merchant shipping and not save the drowning crew, but he was not convicted, because British and American naval forces had done the same thing. The question was wholesome history. Napoleon was not actually small, he was 5'7" average height back then. The reasons rumors spread about him being small was propaganda coming from the opposing army to rally troops and tease the French. This propaganda was led by the opposing general, who was in fact 4'11". Ironic, isn't it? Napoleon wasn't short when compared to the overall average for the time. However, he was short when compared to his upper class social contemporaries, who tended to be much taller than the lower class due to better diet and nutrition, etc. The man that shares Muhammad Ali's birth name, Cassius Clay, was a staunch abolitionist representative in Kentucky pre-Civil War. He was notable for starting an abolitionist newspaper that he armed with 2 cannons and several small arms to defend it with, fought off several pro-slavery attackers throughout the years, and pressured Lincoln to free all slaves in America. Plus, his house was broken into when he was in his 80s, I believe, and he killed one attacker and wounded another before they fled. The man was a legit badass who fought for what was right in a place that no one would have blamed him for keeping quiet, and to me, that's pretty goddamn wholesome. Within his 50-year diary of the 100 Years' War in the 15th century, chronicling endless rapes, murders, and pillage, an anonymous writer in Paris found time to record that there was particularly heavy snow one year, and the citizens made some dang impressive snowmen. He also never fails to tell us whether the year's wine was good or bad. 1424 was a winner, and complains when he can't get his hands on any fresh cherries or soft cheese from Prix. When World War II was concluded, the US military doubted the field reports of their own commanders to such an extreme degree that they ended up using the German field reports that are still used to this day as historical reference. And they say victors write history. Literal opposite. Victors do write history, but the US has always been an idiosyncratic place. The pyramids were already 1,000 years old by the time the last woolly mammoth population died off on an island off the northeast coast of Russia. JFK, Oswald, and Jack Ruby all died in the same hospital. I always found the story of Phineas Gage to be fascinating. It is a study in physiology, biology, sociology and criminology. I always felt it was a bit gory for HS, but I think it's fine to study. Good looking dude too. For 30 years, Canada and Denmark were fighting a brutal war over an island in north, by leaving their own homemade whiskers and troll letter. The Choctaw Nation, a Native American tribe who were still recovering from being exiled to bumfuck nowhere Oklahoma a couple decades earlier, raised $170 to send to island to help with the ongoing potato blight famine. And due to the impact COVID is having on the Native American people, especially the Navajo, I believe, Irish people have raised millions to help them. The time the Lichtenstein Army went to war with, allegedly, 80 men and returned with 81, when an Italian soldier who defected over to Liechtenstein. During the early years of the Ottoman Empire, Muslims, Jews and Christians fought side by side and considered each other as brothers. Although most people prefer the image of Vlad the Impaler as a sadistic psychopath, Most of what he did was because he knew he had to employ psychological warfare against the powerful Ottoman Empire. Much like Nolan's Batman, he wanted to be a symbol of fear. One of his most cleverest attacks was the Tegavus night attack, where he infiltrated a camp alongside a handful of men dressed as Turks, Inglourious Basterds style. The initial plan was to murder the Sultan, but when that failed, Vlad, who could speak fluent Turkish with a native accent, pretended to be Turkish officer, trick he used several times, and spread chaos through the Turkish chain of command. Obviously, we can't condone all the crap he did, but this one was quality hijinks. Some other wholesome facts about the Turkish. IKEA finally admitted that meatballs are a Turkish invention. Sweden probably got them when Turkey served as an asylum for their King Charles, after he lost at Poltava. Despite the Ottoman Empire being depicted poorly in history and pop culture, they practiced freedom of religion and decriminalized same-sex relationships as far back as 1858. Yeah, that's right. Remember when the Brits imprisoned Turing for being gay? Despite the Ottoman Empire being depicted poorly in history and pop culture, they practiced freedom of religion. This aged like milk near the end of the empire. During World War I on Christmas Eve, the Brits and Germans started singing Silent Night Holy Night, then come morning they hung out and played football. But they probably had some awkward conversations. In Bavaria in 1740, Roman Catholics founded a secret society called Order of the Pug. New members in the society had to wear dog collars and scratch at the door to get in. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.